He used to shut his butcher shop. What he cured in the spring house out, earned it all the week the federal inspector padlocked the shop his grandfather had run for 41 years. A man named Owen Vance had exactly $340 to his name, a cardboard box of personal effects from the back office, and a key nobody else wanted. What he found inside that spring house wasn't just meat hanging in the cold. It was a life his grandfather had been quietly building for him since before Owen was old enough to hold a boning knife. If you've ever had something taken from you by someone with a badge and a clipboard, someone who never once looked you in the eye while they were doing it, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. I was 31 years old the morning they locked the door. I want you to understand what that shop was. My grandfather, Thomas Vance, had opened it in 1961. He'd hung his own sign above the door. He'd built the cold cases with his own hands. He'd greased the same band saw for 4 decades until the metal was worn bright where his fingers rested every morning. The shop was on the corner of Elm and 3rd in a town called Marin, population 4,000, and it had fed that town through hard winters and lean years and 2 recessions without ever once turning a customer away. When someone couldn't pay, Thomas Vance took less. When someone needed credit, he gave it. He never wrote it down, and he never collected. I had worked in that shop since I was 9 years old. I knew the smell of it in the early morning, sawdust and pork fat and old iron, and the faint, sweet copper of fresh blood, the way most people know their own kitchen. I knew which floorboards creaked near the walk-in. I knew how many degrees you lost off the case when the delivery door opened. I knew where Thomas kept the good boning knives wrapped in oilcloth on the second shelf, because he didn't trust the magnetic strip on the wall not to nick the edge. Thomas died in October. By the following March, the federal inspector had visited 4 times. The last time, he came with a second man I had never seen before. They wore matching gray polos with agency logos embroidered on the chest. They move through the shop the way men do when they've already decided, not looking for problems, but counting them. The second man had a camera. The first man had a clipboard with pages of handwritten notes I was not permitted to read. They pointed at the ceiling tiles and the grout lines between the floor panels and the age of the ventilation hoods, and they spoke to each other in the low murmur of people who want to appear neutral while delivering a verdict they've prepared in advance. The inspector handed me the notice of closure with the look of a man setting down a bag of groceries. It was a professional look, practiced and empty. "Mr. Vance," he said, "you have 30 days to appeal." He left without asking my name, or how long the shop had been there, or whether Thomas Vance had fed half this county for 40 years on a handshake and a good eye for a cut of beef. He pulled out of the parking lot in a white government truck and was gone before I had finished reading the first page. I packed the office in a single box, a framed photograph of Thomas in his white apron, his hands big as shovels, standing in front of a case full of pork loins. My grandfather's good pen, the one with the engraved barrel he used to sign every invoice by hand. A worn paperback copy of a curing manual so old the spine had split and been repaired with electrical tape. A small brass compass that had no business being in a butcher shop, but that Thomas had kept on his desk for as long as I could remember. I sat in the parking lot with a box in my lap and tried to think. I had $42,000 in appeals costs in front of me, an attorney who'd quoted me $6,500 just to start, a lease on the building that ran through December, and a town full of people who didn't know yet that their butcher shop was closed. I did not have the money to fight. Then I found the envelope. It was at the bottom of the office desk drawer, taped to the underside of the second panel. A plain white envelope with my name written on it in Thomas Vance's unhurried, upright hand. Below my name, 2 words, Springhouse. I had not been to the Springhouse in 11 years. Thomas's land ran 8 miles east of town, back up a hollow where the limestone ridge rose steeply on both sides. and a cold water spring had been running since before anyone in Marin could remember. He'd inherited the 47 acres from his own father and held on to it through everything. Through the Depression's shadow years, through the war, through the creep of development that had eaten the farms on either side of the hollow and left his land sitting there like a tooth that wouldn't come loose. The spring house itself was a low stone building, maybe 16 feet by 20, built directly over the head of the spring so that the cold water ran beneath the floor in channels cut into the bedrock. His grandfather had used it to store dairy. Thomas had used it for something else entirely. I knew that. I had just never known the extent of it. The county bus ran as far as the intersection at Route 9, which was 2 miles short of the hollow mouth. I walked the rest. It was a March morning, cold enough that my breath came out in long white flags, and the last of the snow was still packed in the shadowed places under the ridge where the sun hadn't reached. The road into the hollow was a gravel track that narrowed as it went, trees closing overhead until the sky was reduced to a gray stripe. The air changed as I got deeper in. The exhaust and road salt smell of the county road fell away, and what replaced it was stone and cold water and the clean bite of dead leaves and frozen ground and something underneath that I couldn't name right away, something that belonged to this place alone. The building came into view around a bend in the track. I stopped. It looked smaller than I remembered. The stone walls were thick and heavy, mortared close the way men used to build when they expected a thing to stand 100 years. The roof was board and batten, weathered to gray, with a heavy overhang on the north side. Moss had taken the lower courses of the south wall. The wooden door was iron-strapped, and the strap hinges had bled long rust stains down into the stone. One of the small windows had cracked and been patched from the inside with heavy plastic sheeting. I stood there in the cold and thought about turning around. I'm glad I didn't. The key was old, skeleton style, and it bit into the lock with the sound of metal that had been sleeping. I had to work it twice before the mechanism turned. Then the lock fell open, heavy and solid, and I put my shoulder to the door. The smell came first. It stopped me in the doorway. Not rot, nothing like that. Something ancient and deliberate and deeply alive. Oak and smoke and salt and time and a sweetness underneath it all that I recognized before my eyes had adjusted to the dimness. Not the sweetness of fruit or sugar, but the sweetness of fat properly cured, of something transformed by patience into something else entirely. My eyes caught up. The spring house was hung from floor to ceiling. Every beam, every crossbar, every hook Thomas had driven into the ceiling joists over God knows how many decades, all of it was weighted with meat. Whole hams in their salt crust, ropes of salami dried to a deep burgundy, finocchiona studded with fennel seed that I could smell even across the room, lonza, the cured loin, wrapped in its caul and hung in precise rows, pancetta rolled tight and tied with butcher's twine at 2-inch intervals, hanging in long spirals, guanciale, the cured jowl, in great flat slabs, and coppa, Thomas's coppa, hanging in their canvas bags like the skulls of something holy, the finished ones so deep a red they were nearly black. There were over 300 pieces. I walked in slowly, the way you walk into a church when a service is going on. My feet found the stone floor, and the soft cold air wrapped around me. The air was not like refrigeration, not the mechanical, flat cold of a walk-in, but a living cold, breathing, the cold of stone and deep water and patience. Dust motes moved in the shaft of light from the east window, drifting over the rows of hanging meat, with the slowness of something that had no reason to hurry. I reached out and touched the nearest ham, pressed the salt crust with my thumb the way Thomas had shown me when I was a boy, pressed until I felt the give beneath. The crust was dry and hard, and the color of old ivory. The ham was firm. It was ready, or close. Thomas would have known to the day. I pressed my thumb in, and then I kept my hand there on the salt crust, and I stood in that room with every surface hung with something he had made, and the spring ran quietly under my feet through the stone channels, and I did not say a word. I walked the length of the room slowly, touching things. The salome hung in their white bloom, the coppa in their canvas bags, dimpled and taut and smelling of black pepper and oak, the guanciale in flat slabs that had been rubbed with cracked pepper and dried herbs, whose names I did not yet know. I put my nose close to a pancetta and breathed in, and it was like pressing your face into a dictionary of things that used to be common knowledge, cured fat and salt, and a long, dry sweetness, and something that lived underneath all of that which I could not name, but recognized the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard since childhood. There were over 300 pieces. I counted the coppa alone, 37 bags. At the market price Abernathy would later quote me, each bag was worth between $150 and $220, depending on age. My mind tried to hold that arithmetic and slid off it. I tried again. It slid again. Then I saw the wooden crate in the far corner. It was the old kind, built from pine boards, with a lid held down by a hasp and a padlock. It looked like every other wooden crate in a farmyard. It was sitting on a limestone shelf that jutted from the wall just above the water channel, in the single shaft of cold light that came through the intact window on the east side. The key from the envelope fit the padlock. Inside the crate, under a layer of clean straw, were mason jars, 8 of them, quart jars, sealed with paraffin under the lids. Each jar was labeled in Thomas's handwriting with a date and a dollar amount. I picked up the first jar and held it up to the light. Cash, old bills, folded flat, packed tight. I opened each jar slowly and laid the contents on the stone shelf. When I was done counting, I had to count again because my mind wouldn't hold the number the first time. $22,400. I sat down on the cold stone floor with my back against the crate and my legs straight out in front of me, and I looked at the money on the shelf, and at the hams hanging over my head, and at the light coming through the east window, and I made a sound I had not planned to make. A laugh, short and strange, that bounced off the stone walls and came back at me from 3 directions at once. Then the laugh became something else. I thought about the inspector with his clipboard and his neutral professional face. I thought about the cardboard box in the back of my truck with Thomas's photograph in it, and the worn curing manual with the taped spine. I thought about 30 years of early mornings, and sawdust, and pork fat, and iron, and Thomas standing at the band saw, with his hands on the worn metal, where 1,000 mornings had made the steel smooth. And I thought about all the people he had fed, and all the credit he had given, and all the times he had taken less, because someone needed him to. I put my face in my hands, and I cried in that cold room, with the smell of oak and salt and 40 years of patience around me. And I cried until I had nothing left. And when I was done, I sat there in the quiet, and the cold and the spring ran under the floor, and the light moved in the east window, and I felt something settle in my chest that had been wrong since October. Then I wiped my face, and I looked back in the crate. I carried it outside into the light. Thomas Vance's handwriting filled the pages in his careful, unhurried way, small and even, every letter the same height. He had written the date at the top of the first entry. 17 years ago. Owen, he had written. If you are reading this, one of 2 things is true. Either I am gone, or the shop is gone, or God help us both. They are both gone at once. He had a line through the first page where he'd started and started again, and I could see the pressure of his pen, where he'd written harder than he intended. He was not a man who struggled for words. He had struggled for these. I have been curing meat in the spring house since 1978, he wrote. I never told you the full scope of it because I didn't want it to become a burden before it was ready to become a gift. What is in this room is the result of 23 years of work in the old tradition. What I mean when I say the old tradition is this: air and salt and time and nothing else. No additives, no shortcuts, no compromises for the sake of an inspector's checklist. He went on to tell me what I was holding. The hams hanging in the spring house were Mongolitsa crosses, a heritage breed Thomas had been quietly sourcing from a family farm 2 counties over since the early 90s. He had developed his own salt blend over 15 years of adjustment, using mineral salt pulled from a deposit on the edge of the property. He had been keeping detailed production records, temperatures, humidity, hang weights, cure durations, that filled 4 additional journals stored in a tin box behind the crate. He had, without telling anyone, submitted a single ham to a regional competition in 2001 under a fictitious farm name and won the whole category. He had kept the ribbon, but never displayed it. The spring itself, he wrote, is the reason any of this is possible. He had had the water tested 8 times over 30 years. The mineral content was unusual, calcium and magnesium, in a ratio that produced a particular humidity in the air above the channel that he had never been able to replicate artificially. He had once tried to reproduce his kappa in a rented cooler with a calibrated humidifier, and the result had been good, but not this. Never quite this. The spring house was the instrument. The spring itself was the secret. Then he wrote the words I had not expected. I had the water rights surveyed in 1994. They are deeded to the land and cannot be separated from it. In 2003, an attorney named Arthur Abernathy, his address is below, assisted me in registering a small specialty food operation under the name Hollow Spring Provisions. The registration is current. The production records are complete. The USDA has a separate artisanal exemption pathway for operations under a certain annual production volume that has never been triggered against this operation because this operation has never been officially noticed. The attorney will know what to do with what you have found. He wrote one more paragraph. I kept this from you not to be secretive but to give you something to find. A man who inherits a going thing doesn't know what it's worth. A man who finds something on his own, who walks into a cold room and smells what patience smells like, who sits on a stone floor and counts money that was saved in secret for him, that man knows. He won't sell it. He won't let anyone take it from him. He'll know what it cost. His final line was underlined twice. Everything that can be taken from you. Nothing that can be made with your own hands. Mr. Arthur Abernathy had an office above the hardware store on Main Street. A small man with neat white hair combed flat and glasses he looked over the top of when I spread Thomas's journals on his desk. His office smelled of old paper and furniture polish and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco from a habit he'd apparently quit years ago. He didn't offer condolences. He looked at the records and at the registered business name and at the water rights survey and at the curing journals in their careful sequence, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me over his glasses. Your grandfather, he said, his voice dry and measured as gravel shifted in a pan, spent 30 years building something that nobody can shut down with a clipboard. The butcher shop was a storefront. This is a production facility under an entirely different regulatory framework. Your USDA closure applies to a retail meat operation. It does not apply to a registered artisanal curing operation producing under the threshold. He let that sit. What you have in that spring house, he said, at current market prices for heritage breed, traditionally cured product, is somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000 in finished inventory. Possibly more. The kappa alone. He set his pen down. There's a man who has been making calls about your grandfather's land. goes by the name of Raymond Whitfield. He represents a consortium called Summit Creek Estates. They want the hollow for a private resort development. They've been watching the property since Thomas got sick. I expect you'll hear from them. I heard from them within 2 weeks. The meeting was at Abernathy's office, at my request. 2 men in expensive suits who shook my hand with both of theirs and talked about Thomas's legacy and what a shame it was about the shop and what a valuable piece of land that hollow represented. One of them had a plastic smile that he wore like a man who'd been told it was his best feature. They offered me $110,000 for the 47 acres. I thought about the smell of that spring house in the morning. I thought about the cold water running beneath the stone floor that produced air no machine had ever replicated. I thought about Thomas's coppa hanging in the dark for 18 months while the spring breathed over it. I said no. They came back with $250,000. The man with the plastic smile explained it was more than fair market value for the region. He said the word development several times, each time with a different emphasis, as though saying it with enough variations would eventually unlock a meaning I hadn't considered. I said no again. Then I told them what I wanted instead. Not a sale. A permanent conservation easement on the water rights, which would prevent any development within 400 feet of the spring head in perpetuity. In exchange, Summit Creek Estates could develop the upper ridge acreage on the far side of the hollow, the portion with no spring access, under a set of conditions that included a 20-year lease of grazing rights to 3 local farm families who had been running cattle on informal agreements with Thomas for decades. A one-time payment of $40,000 to the Marin Volunteer Fire Company and an annual easement fee of $18,000 paid to a land trust that Abernathy would help me establish. The man with the plastic smile stopped smiling. The other man asked if I had legal counsel. I said Mr. Abernathy had reviewed everything. They left without answering, but Abernathy told me afterward that Summit Creek had already run the numbers, and the ridge acreage alone was worth more to them than the whole package they'd originally proposed. They would sign. They were just unhappy about it. 3 weeks later, they signed. I was in the spring house the day the papers went through, rehanging the coppa that needed rotation. I had the journals open on the stone shelf, Thomas's temperature notations from 1989 beside my own from the week before, tracking the same variables in the same margins. The spring ran quietly under the floor. The fat on the nearest ham had begun to bloom white, which Thomas had written in his journal meant 6 more weeks, no less. I had taken on a part-time helper, a young woman from the farming college 1 county over, who had written her thesis on heritage breed charcuterie, and who had stood in this room for the first time and made exactly the sound I had made. A long, soft exhalation, like someone who had been looking for a thing and finally found it. George at the hardware store had let me run a tab for the first 3 months, and Martha from the diner had introduced me to a chef in the city who had put our coppa on his menu, and then introduced me to 2 more. Abernathy's Land Trust had its first meeting in the back room of the library, attended by 11 local families. An older man named Jedediah, who ran the general store at the edge of the hollow, had shown up with a handwritten ledger of every informal agreement he'd known Thomas to hold with every farmer in the valley, and he had set it on the table without comment, and it turned out to be the most important document in the room. I stand on the path outside the spring house sometimes in the early morning before I open the door, and I breathe the cold air coming down the hollow, and I smell the stone and the water and the faint sweetness that seeps through the thick walls, and I think about what it means to inherit something. The brass compass from Thomas's desk sits on my own desk now. I don't know what it was doing in a butcher shop either, but I've stopped wondering. The USDA closed a shop that had concrete floors and fluorescent lights and inspectors who could count grout lines. They could not close a spring that had been running through limestone for 10,000 years. They could not touch what patience builds in the cold and the dark. They did not know what Thomas Vance had been slowly, quietly, stubbornly building for 30 years in a stone room that stayed 44 degrees in August and kept the same air it had always kept, the same mineral silence, the same particular cold that made something ordinary into something that people drove 3 hours to taste and paid prices Thomas would have found incomprehensible. He was not incomprehensible. He was just patient in a way that the modern world has trouble understanding. He understood that some things cannot be rushed and cannot be regulated and cannot be shut down with a notice of closure, because they were never about the storefront. They were always about the spring. The most valuable things in this life are often built quietly, in the cold, in the dark, by people who never explain what they're doing because they're too busy doing it. What can be taken from you can be taken again. What you build with your own hands, in your own time, from your own understanding of a thing, that belongs to you in a way that no clipboard and no padlock and no man in a gray polo shirt can touch. If you've ever had something taken from you by people who never learned your name, I want you to know that I understand that. And I want you to look around you and ask yourself what the spring house in your life is. What is the thing that's already there, waiting, that you haven't fully looked at yet? Tell me about a time someone took something from you and what you built instead. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.